Fredrick Allen Hampton was an American Black Panther Party activist and revolutionary socialist. Fred Hampton was a leader in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. Leading their youth council of the organization's West Suburban branch, he came to prominence in Chicago as chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and deputy chairman of the National BPP.
On the evening of December 3rd, 1969, William O'Neill, who was employed by the FBI to infiltrate the Black Panther Party, slipped a powerful sleeping drug into Hampton's drink and then left. Officers were dispatched to raid his apartment. They stormed in and opened fire, killing his security guard. Then they opened fire on Hampton's bedroom, where he laid unconscious from the drug with his sleeping, almost 9 months pregnant fiancée. After the gunfire, he was found to only be wounded and not dead. Upon that discovery, an officer shot him twice in his head and killed him.
Welcome back to the Aboutcast. Today, we're going to be tackling another leader, and we're going to be scoring our leaders from here on out on a scale of about 6 categories: empathy, integrity, collaboration, vision, self-awareness, and their X factor. That'll be scored out of 30, so 5 for each category. And we're taking on Fred Hampton. In these times of turmoil, this young, at the time 21 years old of his death, was a visionary. He was an activist, and he was part of a movement that was much larger than himself.
And to give you a little bit of background on Fred Hampton, he was born August 30th, 1948, and died, like we said, or you heard in the intro, in 1969, December 3rd. So 20 years of age, or 21 years old, when he was assassinated. And that was by a really interesting group, just for a few factors. But the group is called the Counterintelligence Program, or for short, nicknamed COINTELPRO. And that was a government-sponsored kind of branch or agency by the FBI who set out to do a lot of interesting things. And one of them was also to send a letter prompting Martin Luther King, or not prompting, but asking him to commit suicide, and a few other things. Notable things or notable dates around Fred Hampton's lifetime is that Malcolm X got assassinated in 1965. And then, of course, throughout this whole thing, and when Fred Hampton was the most active, Martin Luther King Jr. got assassinated April 4th, 1968, which is a year and 6 months plus of Fred Hampton's assassination as well.
And so if you aren't familiar with COINTELPRO, they essentially in the 60s were what you'd consider a conspiracy theory among the public. People believe that they were out there, but there's no proof until Fred Hampton was murdered. Some documents came out, and they essentially stated the purpose of that home raid was to find and manage Fred Hampton. And then down the line, Fred Hampton's fiance at the time sues the government and wins a few $1 million from this. And they say COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program, has been disbanded. No one is 100% sure if it's actually been disbanded or renamed, but that's those early years. But you have to remember, too, at 21, Fred Hampton was just at the age someone may be coming out of college. He was a tremendous athlete and student that graduated high school with honors. He had a high involvement in the Black Panther movement as a high school student, as a 17 and an 18-year-old. He was so intelligent that he wanted to study pre-law at UCLA. However, he got so engaged in his work with the NAACP chapter and the Black Panther Party that he ultimately stayed in Chicago to help the cause.
A couple tidbits on one, the kind of how the documents came up on COINTELPRO was there was a small branch of two FBI agents who were manning kind of the COINTELPRO headquarters in Pennsylvania. And I don't specifically remember the actual location of the town, but there was a group of people who ended up raiding that and then found all of these documents. And led to the lawsuit and discovering these things. The shocking thing is that I think the best and the most prolific assassination group in history is the government. This one specifically targeted Fred Hampton because of his ideologies of kind of a socialism in a sense, and whatnot. And then to further on your point, Julian, his presence in the Black Party movement, Black Panther Party movement when he was young. He was also credited for a lot of things, and one was that there wouldn't have been as many like African American or Black teachers in the actual Chicago school district where he grew up if it wasn't for Fred Hampton kind of advocating for it as a teen in his 17s, 16s and whatnot. So it's extraordinary to see kind of somebody who has such latent skill, it seems like, being gifted in sports and academics, and obviously quite prolific with persuasion and advancing other people's or his own ideas in a collective manner as well.
And we might say too, I found this interesting, Jordan, is that this leader, Fred Hampton, was extremely self-aware for a 18, 19, 20-year-old who understood his intellect at a very high level, understood his characteristic being extremely charismatic, understanding the power of intelligence and education in these positions, and essentially was using his greatest power of presentation. He was a master orator. He was the likes of what you see MLK, the likes of what you heard from Frederick Douglass, the ability of Sam Cooke in the way of presenting these messages to his people. And that is one of the biggest threats at the time of the 60s from COINTELPRO or the government, is that these activists are understanding and intelligently informing and educating their audiences on how to progress in society. So he uses these skills to impress these opinions and these thoughts and give these think pieces on where African American or Black culture should be moving to in the mid to late 60s as a 20-year-old. It's absolutely phenomenal to think of someone who's a few years younger than me being at that stage, at the height of those tensions and that civil rights movement, to go on stage and go on TV and perform at that level.
I think it's kind of one of the classic like byproducts, and the way that 23andMe can track where your lineage is, or who your cousins are, or who your great grandfather is, and where they come from. It's almost you could see these characteristics in people, and Fred Hampton, I think, is an excellent example, where you mentioned his skill of oration, and I think that's a perfect example of who he was around, talking about Malcolm X, with Dr. Martin Luther King, like you mentioned. These people were exquisite storytellers, and that's how I think one of their greatest strengths, and one that Fred Hampton obviously gleaned off of just by being exposed to, or of course, I'm sure he crafted the skill himself a bit too, just being how prolific of one he was. Another thing that I think is important to talk about is that, two things. One, I think there is a sense of a prodigy in Fred Hampton. We talk about his age and we talk about what he's done, and essentially what that means is that he was extremely advanced for his age. And I think that human beings naturally have a predilection towards people who are extraordinarily gifted, in a sense, where it almost seems unnatural that they could have gained this skill in this amount of time. And I think that's a classic Fred Hampton thing, being that he was doing crazy things and had such an impact on like a global scale for such a young age. And I think that helped him with his charismatic kind of charm, in a sense, where people really could get behind somebody, not in almost, in the sense of modern day, you think of a young person not being intelligent or not being worldly enough to take on the views of something as complex as social justice. But he actually kind of used something that would be a disadvantage of normal people, being like lack of experience and age, as kind of as one of the things that made him so compelling, being so young and gifted. And I think that's extraordinarily clear in that. And you could just see he's a thinker, extraordinarily intelligent as far as creative problem solving by the things he does that we'll talk about a little bit more with the non-aggression pact. He's extraordinarily generous and things of that nature, where it's just it's kind of freaky to see all these characteristics in a human being, for one, but to see them at matured and developed at such a young age is that just sets it even further on.
And as a young adult, Fred Hampton was also extremely grounded. I think that's where some leaders can get lost in their path, is losing their roots, losing what drove them to be where they're at. And Fred Hampton understood Chicago, understood his representation. And I think other individuals saw themselves in him, even though he was 20 or 21. And also, the Black Panther Party has always been majorly female with male representatives. And so on the other end, you have Angela Davis, who is highly intelligent as well, battling her own lawsuits from her research and feeding between her and Fred Hampton passings and spending notes that there is this sense of unity going on. And so for Fred Hampton, he understood before he was in the Black Panther Party, he was working with the NAACP. And what he was doing at 17 and 18 was forming this West Suburban branch all on his own. It didn't exist. He used his powers and his intellect to persuade over 500 members to join the NAACP in the 60s. And you have to remember, back then, it wasn't nearly as easy to spread information as it is today to get people to join. We always think in common terms, but Fred Hampton was putting the foot to the pavement, utilizing very detailed and specific messaging strategies to attract fellow young Black or African American or people interested in the NAACP movement to join his branch. And so he creates this branch of over 500 members, and the NAACP is super stoked, to say the least. And Fred slowly starts to see, I really like what I'm doing with the NAACP, but I'm starting to align with the Black Panther Party in some regards, and transitions from NAACP to the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party itself, you don't just start at the top or get to the top like Fred Hampton did. He had to start at the bottom.
Yeah. And I think that's another kind of, I know it's going to sound like it's almost like we're putting this guy up on a pedestal, which you'll later on, we'll talk about kind of some of his weaknesses. And although we didn't have very many from our research, he did have one that was extremely, an extreme detriment of him as the leader. But, I think that, once again, this is a young kid. The Black Panther Party movement recognized him from his work with the NAACP, and he worked his way all the way up doing like certain initiatives. I think that it's we'll talk about, and he eventually works his way up to a chairman. And, through that time, I feel like it's kind of like a locomotive or a train where, it's when it first starts, almost like a rocket ship, where it first starts, and the rocket ship takes off. The last, SpaceX did a rocket launch to the moon, or not the moon, but the International Space Station. And when you see a rocket launch, you see this tall kind of monolithic thing, and then you hear the countdown, 4, 3, 2, 1. You hear this massive and giant explosion. But if you actually are just staring at it and you put it on mute, you would see this thing kind of, the flames at the bottom of it. But at first you don't see it move at all, and then it starts like slowly moving. And then you're like, okay, so it's off the ground and it's, moving. And now it's like going even faster. And now it's even going faster than you realized it, it was going, and then it breaches the atmosphere. And I think that was kind of Fred Hampton's like an inertia and momentum when it came to his work and how quickly he came about. Where, if you were to track it, you'd almost be, if you blinked, you would miss a big chunk of that. For the Fred Hampton rocket ship, Fred Hampton X, it was slow, but then it got extremely fast, extremely quick. And throughout his lifetime, obviously, but also throughout his moments being, working for social justice and civil rights.
And I think that's a great example. I didn't really thought of it that way, Jordan. I think what history shows you, whether it's literature or videos, or stories, it never shows you the background work that's happening. And so when Fred Hampton joins, you have to remember, right, that MLK and Malcolm X are still alive and preaching their messages for civil rights in very different regards. And he's taking this information and deciphering and also discussing with other leaders and members of the Black Panther Party what this means, what they can do to take action, how to help progress and unite as many people as possible for their civil rights and to move forward in society. And that's one of the things that stays consistent with Fred Hampton is his integrity. He never changed, right? He always had the same vision in some regard, even though he was very, very young. He understood his power and his message that he wanted to preach, and nothing was going to change that. If he heard Martin Luther King say one thing, or Malcolm X, or Angela Davis, or anyone in that circle say something, he was going to decipher that and say, does that align with my message? Do I need to preach violent terms in some regards as Malcolm X? Do I need to be as delicate as Martin Luther King? Do I have to be as outspoken as Angela Davis? And throughout the time, he shapes himself, but keeps that message standard, which is very tough as a leader as you get this power and people are giving you all this information to stay within the realm of what you truly believe in.
I think the clear sign, and I'm sure we'll see it in other people as well, is just like a ludicrous sense of conviction and his resolve, which is personally one of my most, because I think resolve is kind of a systematic, or can be a systematic trait towards gratitude. But further on in that point, I think that his resolve of kind of, I think neo-socialist could be a good word to describe him, of kind of the way that he worked was so in stride and in tune with what he was kind of what he believed. And so with that neo-socialism to, take away from the extremely rich and help out the impoverished was, many of his acts. So the beautiful thing about this guy was that he walked the walk and quicker than I think he even talked the talk. And a perfect example is so there was an incident where one of his first times being arrested had to do with kind of this socialist like act. And it was quite like Robin Hood-esque. And I think that Robin Hood's like the perfect, or the first, childhood thing of a socialist that we get that's a hero. And not that this is beyond what my personal perspectives of a socialist is, but he stole about 71 ice cream bars to give to the underprivileged, so like inner city kids or kids that couldn't afford it on a really hot day in Chicago. And obviously, sneaking. Could you imagine stealing 71 of anything? It could be short of like 71 like letters, and like just going about it like there's a sure shot that you're going to get caught. But through this man's conviction and resolve of pushing the socialist agenda forward and walking that walk, like I said, he did that thing. And then this stacks up on later he does bigger things. This Fred X movement again, he had a free breakfast program where he basically fed, I think, about 600 people in the mornings, and just fed them socialism. He was pushing that agenda. He also had a thing of, like free legal support to people as well. And I think that this is just, one of the strongest things. And I would love to debate this topic because, as you can, we'll go through the scores later, but I was having a hard time determining what that actually was because, in a sense, there is like Julian mentioned, there is empathy on our scale, which I think is extraordinarily important for not only a leader, but just a regular person's success. But I'm not necessarily sure that's not just sympathy, because he grew up around this stuff. And even though he was extraordinarily intelligent and seemed like he had so many resources, there was a rumor that said that his mom, and I apologize for not confirming this beforehand, but I thought this would be a perfect example of a place while I was doing research. I heard this. His mom babysat Emmett Till. So there's these, I don't know how to describe it. I think that there's a real sense of something that he's lived through that he doesn't want others to live through himself, which isn't technically empathy, but is sympathy, which is close to, but not the same thing. What are your thoughts on that, Julian?
So I think when I take a step back, right, that free breakfast program was huge in a lot of ways. As Jordan said, it fed a tremendous amount of people. And it wasn't like Fred Hampton just came out and did it one day on a whim. He had gone to the local precincts and governments in order to get a form of aid or welfare to help with this cause. And basically at the time, right, in the 60s, everyone was saying, we don't want to help the black man, the black woman in any regards in these strategies. And so Fred continued to push on and found a way to fund this free breakfast program. And even with the law assistance, he went to a ton of lawyers to try to get that help, and very few gave him the okay that they would work with him. And it was all these steps you don't see behind the scenes to do so, and how many times this dude was shut down in order to do these jobs. I'm sure he had a tremendous amount of ideas that never got anywhere because no one wanted to help. You look back on it and you're like, oh, free breakfast program, that makes sense. That's going to help in some regards. It's going to add nutrition. It's going to add aid to these communities that need help. And I think where that pivots to is in terms of, it being, I understand where you're coming from in terms of empathy and sympathy. And I think, if you look at the very broad understanding of empathy, it's just the simple ability to understand or share those feelings. And I think for him, it's a little bit of both. I think he understands those feelings as a young black man who came up through that and was raised through a similar system or environment. And he's also sharing those feelings because now, as you pivot from a 14-year-old to a 18-year-old, your perspective changes. Your feelings start to feel, instead of sad or hungry at a young age, you start to feel mad or aggravated, and you understand what you have to do to push this forward. And you could say that Fred fell under that category of socialism in some regard, more specifically revolutionary socialism, and believing that some sort of revolution is necessary to bring these large structural changes. And so he's trying to create this revolution in himself from the feelings of what he knows now and what he sees in his local community, and preaching that message to a larger choir in order to start poking the bear and making these changes occur and bringing it to, if anything, national attention to get that sympathy from a larger audience who's starting to say, you know what, that's not right. The only way people back then were learning about this stuff was on TV or the radio. Once again, they didn't have any form of quick communication. It was the TV or the radio. The TV didn't pick it up. You didn't know. So Fred Hampton used his power to push himself to make these and talk about these changes and mention the free breakfast program or this law assistance when he was being filmed for whatever reason, or they were interviewing or sitting in on a speech, to push that to a larger group or demographic to also understand and share those feelings throughout the United States.
Okay. So you're essentially kind of equating it to not particularly his ability of empathy, but his ability to invoke others to feel empathy, which I think is maybe notably different, but I think kind of goes on to another spot that I think is probably pinpoints that a little bit better was as far as collaboration. And I think collaboration is ridiculous. Like, this dude is really extraordinary when it comes to that. And when I mentioned creative problem solver, it's like when I was reading and doing research on Fred, so essentially to give you guys, let you guys in my head and understand what I'm talking about. Yeah, this dude was extraordinarily persuasive, and not only, in collaboration with others around his specific movement, but collaboration around people that necessarily weren't particularly initially right off the bat interested in that. And I think that's probably where the invocation of empathy, we're on the same point on that, where he was extraordinarily gifted in that sense, or sharp, because he had a non-aggression pact, which particularly pinpointed the most aggressive members of our society today, which is gang members. And so essentially what he would do is that with kind of the message of, this is what we're about, the Black Panther Party movement. And it's particularly what Fred is about, because obviously Fred is, Fred at all times and stays on brand with, I actually really enjoyed the thing that you said as far as social revolutionary, I think is what you said. And well, Fred says, I'm a revolutionary. It's one of his classic sayings, but I just want you guys to think about like how creative that is to go to. It's almost like, and I don't have an analogy for this particularly right now, but if you can imagine going to these gangs that don't give a shit about you and compelling them to feel a certain way, to be on your team, to not only, push your cause, but also do something that might be against their nature as far as not being aggressive. And that might be towards another gang member or another person. But, that level of collaboration is ridiculous. It's just crazy, man. And once again, I mean, we're beating a dead horse here, but I think it's necessary, being that it's so extraordinary. This kid he's a kid, man. He's a kid while he's doing this. And not to sound disrespectful when I say kid, but as far as life goes, man, he was a fourth of his way through life, just about a quarter of his way through life in doing these things, where, it's almost like somebody, maybe he was playing in a different league. If let's say that an NBA player was playing in the NBA and then for some reason got brought down into the G League, you'd just be like, he shouldn't be playing on this level. And I don't think that Fred Hampton should have been doing the things he was doing, or it doesn't make sense for such a young kid to be doing those things.
And that non-aggression pact between two gangs is, I think, an analogy you could use as if, you listener we're in Southern California and you looked at two of the predominant black gangs and the Bloods or the Crips, and you said, for this point in time, why don't we just calm it down and focus on a larger movement and avoid this type of violence towards one another. And essentially, it was between Chicago's most powerful street gangs at the time, and that was between the Young Patriots and the Young Lords, and he did it, right? And this kind of leads into the other portion of him, is what he saw, what he wanted to see as a revolutionary. As you go through this non-aggression pact, you want to cut out the violence occurring in the city of Chicago. You go to these gangs and you start to work on that. And then you develop a broader picture for equal representation within what we eventually come to know as the multicultural movement, the Rainbow Coalition. And so they utilize this coalition concept to bring in a variety of organizations to help for this movement. And this was a big thing that put them on the radar for the government at that time, is that highly intellectual, bringing a diverse group of people and organizations together to create this power to persuade the area, the state, the country to look into these nasty doings and these nasty structures that have been placed around them as the Black community is frightening to someone who's trying to maintain power.
It was, I think, about when he was 17, from what I read, that the FBI was watching Fred. So before, I think that's, you could imagine that it would be in a movie, but the kid is a hacker where the FBI would be watching him or them. So it's just it's crazy. It's crazy. And, the main reason that the COINTELPRO was so interested in Fred was at the time, there was a lot of pressure and a little bit of history. There was a lot of pressure between, obviously, international forces. We're talking Russia, and also a little bit further out east of kind of this socialist and communist friction rubbing up against the, of course, capitalist ideas of the West. And so being that these were so fresh and kind of such a prevalent threat in America, the U.S. kind of bumped up anybody who was making too much noise about the socialist cause or anti-capitalist ideas. That's who they keyed in on specifically at this time, and was somewhat of an interest in the actual COINTELPRO. And so that's why they keyed in on some of these people, as far as Martin Luther King and Fred Jones as well. And to further on the point with the vision, because we're stepping through this, and for you, those of you who are listening at home, this is obviously kind of going through actually what we're scoring on. So we're giving you the evidence of why we decided to score on these things. But one more thing on the vision is that he also produced, as a chairman of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party movement, he also kind of fostered and created the Police Accountability Project, which is still going on today. And essentially what they are doing, and now they're called the National Police Accountability Project, so NPAP, and they're obviously quite active this year and around this time, being it is 2020, with basically accountability legislation with police officers, legal action when it comes to those who have been wronged by police, and looking into all of those things. So this vision of, this dude once again walked the walk, and walked the walk, and then I think talked the talk in some senses. So even backwards than you usually hear this saying, because he was doing a lot. And this is one that exists today and is still quite prevalent. Well, especially during these moments of kind of unrest, you could say. So another really strong point of him kind of fostering people of his community, of his type, and of his demographic, and not necessarily, you don't need to look into Black, but there's other communities that are afflicted by corruption and the things that he was seeing in his neighborhood as far as lack of resources. And that's why he did his outreach programs for the food, so that people can have something to eat, and things of that nature. So there's things in not even, it's you can't really say a vestige or vestigial limbs of Fred Hampton's, but because they're alive still, but there's things that he's left behind that is quite active and prevalent to this day, which is an attribution to his ambition. Of course, he wasn't leading it 20 years ago because it wasn't around, but the founding and getting that up and off of its legs and into good leadership is something that I don't think that you could not credit Fred Hampton for, at least in some sort of way.
I agree. And I think there's a plethora of areas that Fred Hampton used his ability to seek information positively and shape a vision for his future and what he'd like to see. He was, in terms of the Black Panther Party, he was a huge advocate for the Black Panther Party. Had a 6-week political training to join the Black Panther Party. He didn't believe in run and gun, so to speak, join the party and you're a Black Panther. He believed if you want to be a Black Panther, I want you to at least understand some base foundationals of politics in the political environment you're in, of your neighborhood, your county, your government, your national government. Understand these things so that way when you are questioned or you are questioning, you understand what they're rooted in. And the Black Panther Party sought out their individuals and brought them into these trainings. And so that way you could at least have Fred Hampton inform and have these conversations with people who at least vaguely understand the political system. And going back to that police accountability project, what we look at eventually is how Fred Hampton dies, right? And so William O'Neill is essentially arrested twice for car theft and impersonating a federal officer when he crosses lines. And so the FBI of Chicago recruits him after a plea deal and says, hey, we're going to reduce your sentence and the impact of these crimes if you join the Black Panther Party, if you infiltrate the Black Panther Party. And that's who William O'Neill is. So William O'Neill joins the party, begins to rise in the organization. He becomes the director of security and Fred Hampton's bodyguard. And there's part of me that wonders, right, is that William O'Neill does this deal, and to rise in the Black Panther Party quickly, you have to be engaged and you have to enjoy what you're doing. And I think it's a very unfortunate system for which, he took this deal for his wrongdoings and found something he may have actually enjoyed, but was tied to the FBI and the government, as Jordan alluded to, who's been watching Hampton since he's 17, to watch him further, to be their informant, to be his security, his bodyguard. And so they're continuing to work with him and understand what Fred Hampton's doing. And William O'Neill is basically reporting back to them like, well, Fred's just feeding children right now. He's working on, the local community. He's doing this, that, and the third. And at the time, the president, I believe is J. Edgar Hoover, is saying, we don't want to hear he's doing good things. We want to see the bad things he's doing. We want to hear any potential thing we can spin. And so he starts providing that evidence to the government and the FBI while they're spying on him to understand those doings and what may be happening within the Black Panther Party at the time, which in itself is something that Fred Hampton, in his accountability project, in his understanding of the government, I'm sure was opposed to, right? Is utilizing someone's problems that they may have been pushed into to further harm someone else. And that's kind of where William O'Neill comes into in the later death of Fred Hampton.
And really quickly, I want to kind of add a little bit of color to that too. William O'Neill not only did the job for the FBI kind of as a contractor, but he was so good, he provided floor maps of exactly what Fred Hampton's apartment looked like. He, gave such great intelligence and pieces of importance to the FBI that they actually gave him a bonus for everything he did after everything was done of, if you can imagine, $300. So, it's just crazy. But I think this is kind of a perfect part to, bring it to the actual scoring guide, because we did talk about empathy, integrity, collaboration, vision, self-awareness, and then the X factor, which I think we alluded to a little bit. And the X factor is kind of what we imagine is the, how amazing or how great is the, the special characteristic or the sharpest tool of the leader's repertoire, and how well did they use it and effectively working with their towards their vision and whatnot. So I guess how about we just go through each and every one of these, Julian, as far as, I'll say empathy, you say your empathy, and then we, with points and things that we've said before on that. Sound good?
Yeah, let's run it up.
Okay. So empathy, I scored him a 2, and a little bit lower than Julian, but I think the reason why is because, once again, I was battling between empathy and sympathy in that aspect, and that's obviously no cut to Fred Hampton, but as far as feeling what others felt and how others felt, I think that a lot of different leaders have been amazing at this, and Fred obviously had that and skill set, but I gave him a 2 for that. It's for that specific reason.
That's fair. I gave him a 3. I think I think he gave good understanding and shared his feelings well. I don't think it was at an extraordinary level or anything different than the average individual. And so for me, I gave a 3, just relating it to the average individual on the scale of empathy. He understood his background and understood his audience, but I don't think he truly tapped into that, or tapped into his own feelings to provide a larger message or, larger deeds down the road. And so that gives us a total score of empathy at 2.5 points.
And so as far as integrity goes, I gave Fred Hampton a 3. And with integrity, I was thinking about, how he, conveyed himself, held himself, and I think everything was exemplary. And, nothing that was extreme. I think Dr. Martin Luther King is an outlier with integrity, being that he was quite turned the other cheek. Fred Hampton, I think, played almost like, see, it's going to get nerdy, but I'll make it quick. So, we're talking about Jedis and Sith Lords, where if you're not a Jedi, which is completely the light, and you're not a Sith Lord, which is the dark, you're somewhere in the gray area. And I think Fred Hampton is a gray Jedi or lights, force wielder. And that's why I give him a 3.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, once again, kind of an average amount of integrity. I mean, he stood behind his message in the face of pressure. I think he knew who he was. I didn't see any crazy evidence that persuaded me to bring that up to a 4 or a 5. And I agree in there. And so that gives us another total score, an average for integrity at 3. So far, Fred Hampton, between empathy and integrity, is at 5.5 points.
So when we go to collaboration, this one was a little tough because I was split between 2 numbers. It was a 4 and a 5. And the reason why so high is because of his ability to tackle creative problem solving and complex problems, and not only with his group efforts on reaching out to the public, but I think that's one of Fred Hampton's greatest strengths, and one that we talk about with closing. His ability to kind of tackle big giant problems, utilizing group skill and group force. So 5 for that young man on that one.
Yeah, I didn't think I was going to give it a 5 this early, but I gave him a 5. I think, and during the time as a black male, to bring over 500 people to the NAACP, to use your voice to grow the Black Panther Party, the non-aggression pack, speaking with different leaders, and that to create so much fear in the government that they need to infiltrate and essentially assassinate you, is a godly amount of collaboration and part of the X factor of Fred Hampton that you aren't going to catch every day on the street from your local Fred Meyer cashier, your local grocery store cashier, or someone you walk by. And I think he definitely exceeds in that area to bring a lot of groups together, because I didn't even mention it, but the Rainbow Coalition is so big, that idea is so vast, that as a 20-year-old is absurd to think about getting all of the agreements to do that. So we gave him a 5. That averages out to a 5 there as well. So now he's at 10.5 out of 30 points with a few categories left.
So the next category we're going to be talking about is vision. And so as far as vision goes, obviously we talked about it quite a bit. Fred's socialistic vision. And the reason I gave it a 4 and not a 5 is because one, I think there's some actual technical flaws with socialism in a sense, and maybe not totally thought out by Fred Hampton, but it's kind of somewhat of a personal view on that. As far as his kind of resolve for his vision was exquisite, but as far as the actual foundation that he was standing on, I think it's quite flawed. Or not quite flawed, but there's enough for me not to give him a perfect score on vision.
Yeah, I gave him a 4 as well, above average. Part of me, the reason I didn't give him a 5 in this case was, not to discredit, I think Fred Hampton was at the right place at the right time with his ideas. I think he was extremely courageous to do so. And some of those ideas you have to extrapolate on, but I think some of those ideas may have occurred within the Black community at some point, maybe from someone else, or been tasked. But I do think the courage to bring that to the forefront and think that way as a 20-year-old was definitely above average. And so once again, a 4, averaging out to a 4 from us. And we're moving on to our final 2 categories.
So our second to last category is self-awareness. And you'll see I gave Fred Hampton another 2 on this. And one is the classic downfall. And I think self-awareness is also kind of awareness of what's around you. So not only like, how you are doing like internally, but I think self-awareness is kind of an art to awareness in general. So I gave him a 2 just for his lack of awareness of not only, him as a person, which would be difficult to know as such a young person, but self-awareness in how he conducted himself and who he like left around as well, because there's enough introspection and letting somebody infiltrate that deeply into your cause. And I'm absolutely not blaming Fred Hampton for being assassinated or having a mole in his operatives and not catching it. That's extraordinarily difficult. But it definitely is one of the factors that I need to weigh out and measure when giving Fred Hampton the score of a 2.
Yeah, that's fair. Now that I hear you explain it, I gave him a 3. I think he just fell into that category of a very powerful 20-year-old, knew just enough about himself to be effective. Had he gone outside of his comfort zone a bit more often, sought after other opinions or ideas throughout the United States at that time, he may have found a bigger motive or a bigger group, or a better way to present his message. By no means was he not self-aware. Was he godlike? I think he just kind of fell in the middle road where he knew just enough about himself to persuade that message, but unfortunately didn't at the time with the ability to get information, just didn't do a lot of the legwork, probably because he was busy doing other things and helping others, that he never really found out more about himself or what he could utilize of his strengths to take it to the next level.
And so that was a 2.5 on average. And then for X Factor, which is kind of we might want to talk about this a little bit more as far as our, the special characteristic, and it could be different between Julian and I as well. So I personally gave him an X Factor of 4. And the reason why is because, it's almost like a hero's journey cut before you get the full revolution of it. And for the kind of the self-actualization on the other side, Fred Hampton was just ramping up his battle for social justice. And I think the one thing that really was amazing and galvanized people was something I talked about quite a bit in this podcast already, as far as his prodigy-like characteristics. And I think that was one of the most powerful things that he brought to the table, being so young and so prolific. And that's why I gave him a 4.
Okay. So for me, I think the X factor for Fred Hampton was his oration skills and his persuasiveness and that charisma. And I think it fell into a 3 for me because that was his biggest skill. And I think it kind of ties in with self-awareness, where I think if he had just been a bit bigger, right, it wasn't who he was, and that's why I gave him, such a high score on collaboration and vision. It just like taking his message outside of Chicago more often and going on these large speaking tours that other Black activists were doing at that time, I think could have really persuaded a lot more people, because I think he fell in that middle between, at the time, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X on 2 ends of the spectrum, where you find that middle ground, and a lot of people would have aligned with that, and he could have educated, and then they could have gone on to, side with one of MLK or Malcolm X at that time. But I think that's why I gave him a 3. And so overall, run it back: empathy, 2.5, integrity, 3, 5.5 total points, collaboration, 5, 10.5, vision, 4, 14.5, self-awareness, 2.5, that gives us 17, and his X factor, 3.5, giving him a total score of 20.5 out of 30. That is Fred Hampton. Jordan, do you want to hit him with the outro?
Absolutely. So this will kind of be a closing thoughts on Fred Hampton. So Fred Hampton was an impact leader. somewhat of a high flying act of a leader. His highly persuasive and charismatic ways were amplified by his creative ways of problem solving with the non-aggression pact and so on. His youth and his willingness to walk the walk with the multiple public outreach programs he undertook. There are so many leaders that pair persuasiveness with cold and calculating precision. Fred Hampton used a technique that maximized the effectiveness of group achievement to goals, common goals, that is, specifically in a field. And I think that's really, really characteristic of a lot of military leaders, which makes sense, being that the Black Panther Party was quite militant in character, where they would have large overarching goals that could only be achieved by a group effort over medium to long-term horizons. This specific leadership strategy, I think, is perfect for the institutional racism Fred was and we are still up against. And I think that that's kind of is actual weakness in itself. But I'll let you take it from there, Julian.
And so this Sun Tzu quote, I think, captures it well. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Fred Hampton knew himself and played to his strengths, but clearly underestimated his enemy. He'd been tracked by the FBI since in high school, and of course, it would be hard to assume that was happening. But after the assassination of MLK, it is arguable to think that Fred could have drawn eyes from work that he'd commenced and continued on to tell and persuade a bigger mission. That's Fred Hampton.
I hope you guys enjoyed that and kind of follow us along in this journey and be an active participant in looking closely at leaders. And, you know, if you have somebody that you think would be interesting to analyze, like we just did Fred, please reach out to us, through our email, which is the Aboutcast at gmail.com, or also on Anchor and the other sites that you can find us on. Please leave us rate us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and the like. We greatly appreciate it, and we really, really enjoy giving you guys the content that we can produce and the thoughts and the ideas. It's really something. It's a privilege. Absolutely. So thank you all.
We appreciate your time. We appreciate you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Peace.